All right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thanks very much. 4th of July, thanks for anybody coming out. That's amazing that so many of you did come out. I appreciate it very much on this national holiday. And because it is the 4th of July, I thought, come on, we have to do the ethics of nationalism, because what else are you going to do on the 4th of July? So, let's see. Oh yeah, class, there's still one spot, maybe two left in the class if there's a couple. Thanks everybody who is enrolled. Again, packages will go out at the end of the month, and then they'll be for the end of August, beginning of September. So if anybody's left, be fast, because there's like one, maybe two spots left, like I said, if there's a couple. So, ethics of nationalism. Now, one of the interesting things about nationalism is, it's newish, historically speaking. The notion of a nation, or more particularly what we're really talking about is a nation state, is a new thing. When exactly it starts, okay, once again, historical arguments. Some people will put this to the Treaty of Westphalia, which is 1640 something, 48, thank you, 1648. And then I think that's a little early. I would argue that it comes actually a little later. You get the seeds of it are being expressed in the Treaty of Westphalia, but you don't really see full-blown nationalism for maybe another 50 to 100 years, depending on what you score, but right around in there. So I thought it'd be good to start with definitions, and so we can understand there's two things a lot of things going on, but two different ideas that don't actually sit well with each other that you need to have before you can get nationalism. And then many of the problems and ideas and motivations that we see related to nationalism grow out of the tension between these two actually quite different and sometimes quite tension-filled ideas. So first definition is of a nation. What is a nation? And a nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, and/or, these should be all and/ors, inhabiting a particular country or territory. So notice, a nation is just a pile of people who, for whatever reason, think they're kind of similar-ish, generally in an isolated geographic location, sort of an identifiable geography. Now, why this matters is for much of history, many of the political entities that were on the ground were not organized this way. The Roman Empire is famous for conquering lots of things, but when they conquered, what they usually did is just put a governor in your capital city, and then they would just leave. They didn't try to, as long as you paid your taxes, they didn't bother you, right? Pay your taxes, do whatever you want. They might reform a little bit, but mostly they just wandered off to go conquer other people. And then if you created problems for some reason, they would send a legion back and kill a bunch of people, and then they'd put another governor in charge, and so it would go. So the Romans didn't think that all the territories that they had conquered were homogeneous culturally or linguistically. In fact, the idea would have been preposterous to them. It was called the Roman Empire because what they really cared about was Rome, which was one city and its immediate environs, and the political elites that were founded in Rome that spread out all over the world. That's what they meant, Roman Empire. They didn't mean all these people. They didn't care about the people in that sense. So nation, the concept of a nation, is really a new thing. Another thing you can look at is all like the Habsburg, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They had people spoke 20, 30 languages or more spread out all over. A lot of the things they ruled were not contiguous with other parts that they ruled. I mean, there was stuff over here, stuff over there. They're one group, they're another group, they're another group, they're another group, all strung together, not culturally, linguistically, historically. There was no association, not geographically linked. That's not how power worked. So that the notion of a nation is actually itself not newish, but not a very common and not an important political concept for much of history and much of the world. China being a notable exception, by the way. China, early pioneers in building the nation as we understand it. Then you get the notion of a state, or i.e. nation state. So a state or a nation state, as a political model, the nation state fuses two principles. The principle of state sovereignty. Now this is crucial. First articulated in the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, there it is, which recognizes the right of states to govern their territories without external interference, and the principle of national sovereignty, which recognizes the rights of national communities to govern themselves. National sovereignty is in turn based on the moral philosophical principle of popular sovereignty, according to which state belongs to their peoples. The latter principle implies the legitimate rule of a state requires some sort of consent by the people. Now, notice a couple of things here. One principle is the right of states to govern their territories without external interference. The second principle is the sovereignty which recognizes the right of national communities to govern themselves. These are completely different ideas. What the magic of the Treaty of Westphalia is it sort of did a sleight of hand trick and said, hey, presto, these are the same. They're totally different, right? Which is, of course, the next subsequent 400 years of European war sort of demonstrates, right? Like that this is not, these don't mesh really well. Because, for instance, if I'm, say, Croatian, and I'm in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire as a political entity, as a political state, says we get to tell you what to do. We are your sovereigns. We rule you. The nation, the nation in waiting perhaps of Croatia says we're a geographically defined, linguistically defined, culturally moderately homogenous group, and so we get to express our right to rule ourselves. Ooh, who's right? Answer, have a bunch of civil wars all over the world for the next 300 or 400 years to determine this question. And it turns out it's a very vexed, very challenging, very difficult weaving of two really different ideas. So one, the notion of a geographically defined, however, area of moderately, culturally, often linguistically homogenous people who have some sort of sense of self-identity that they want to express, versus the notion of state power, which is a political institution that generally claims the right to violence. This is one of the key ideas, is that the state has the ultimate right to violence, and it gets to express its will and control the people who inhabit the state. And so this produces the modern nation state, which we're very familiar with because we've been living in them our entire lives. However, notice it is very new. Right? Like nation states are a new thing on the planet. They didn't come into being in the Treaty of Westphalia. They just sort of expressed the idea. And again, it's probably not until 100, 150 years later that you really get full-on nation states. Germany, for instance, was only practically in the late 1800s when it sort of vaguely organized into a nation state. Lots of English historians argue that England never was, never has been, never will be. Like it's not. I'm serious. Serious, deep thinking, dedicated British historians are like, yeah, we're not a nation state. Never were, never will be. That's one of the clear arguments that they make. So it's a vexed and confusing concept. But what it means is, for us in practice, is we are born into political entities that claim, and in fact functionally do have the right to set many of the patterns of our lives, regardless of what we think. Notice these are not voluntary organizations. This is one of the curious things about nation states. The analogy I think of is pretty much most of the world is opposed to arranged child marriage. We think that you shouldn't take kids who are 2 or 3 and marry them off to other kids who are 2 or 3. That's wrong. And we think that's wrong because we think an important decision like that alters your life you should be old enough to have some input into it. But think of the nation state you're born into. Think how much impact that has on your life, your identity, how you live, the legal constraints under which you operate, the tax constraints under which you operate. All of those things are influenced. You have no choice, right? You do not choose, generally, your nation. Now, you can immigrate, but of course this creates a whole pile of other problems. In fact, the difficulty of immigrating for most of the people in the world to most other places in the world underlines how influential and how powerful the concept of the nation state is in governing our lives. It's a relatively rare phenomenon, in part because it's so difficult. Why? Because we are legally, politically, identified as members of a political authority without our consent. We did not consent to this, we were born into it. The best you can do is unconsent, But it turns out for most of the people in most of the world, this is either virtually impossible or really, really difficult. So it is this organizational structure that we're born into. Now, how do they function, right? We did not choose this. How do they function? The key, there's many arguments about this and many ways you could approach it, but I think one of the key things to understand is that what nation states do is they tell a story. And they tell a story that helps us understand who we are, why we exist, what we're supposed to do. That narrative is incredibly helpful. So if you think about American history, there's a couple of narratives that we have in our history. One is, of course, today is the War of Independence, that we fought against England for freedom, right? We know this narrative. That is the narrative of American history. The fact that people had been living here a long time before any Europeans showed up, that doesn't figure in that narrative. The notion that there were people living here a long time before the revolution, that doesn't figure in the narrative. My favorite part about it is that, I put the dates here because I can never remember dates. Alaska and Hawaii became states in 1959. What the hell does the American War for Independence in 1770s have to do with two states that were added, 150 years later? That's hilarious. That's nothing to do with them. Like the people in Hawaii hanging out and all of a sudden they're like, oh, we're in the United States. How the hell did that happen? Wait, what? What's going on? Right? This is very strange. It's a very strange notion. But the idea is, no, you're part of the narrative. You're a member now. Right? You're official, whether you want to be or not. It doesn't matter. You are a member now. You're born into it. New Mexico and Arizona were added in 1912. So this is 50 years, 60 years after another great event in American history, the Civil War. So we always talk about the Civil War, like the North versus the South. Well, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Alaska, and Hawaii did not exist when the Civil War was fought. What does the Civil War have to do with them? They weren't even, right? But notice the geographic notion doesn't matter. The historical notion doesn't matter. It's the narrative that matters. Once you become a state, you all of a sudden become a member of this shared history that then informs and structures your understanding, outlook, interactions with the world. Now, this is, of course, bizarre in many, many ways. So, for instance, one of the things people always like to say is, America, we helped defeat fascism. And I'm like, I did incredibly little fighting during World War II. I really embarrassingly did practically nothing, right? And it's an odd claim, but people make this claim, right? Because it's part of the narrative that lets us understand who we are. We're the kind of people who defeat fascism, particularly when we get attacked by the Japanese in our colonies, right? So we entered the war to fight fascism when the Japanese attacked us in a completely different part of the world. It's bizarre, but true, right? That's when we really got tired of fascism, was when the Japanese attacked our colonies in the middle of the Pacific. Strange, but true. There it is. But that's not the narrative, right? That's not the story that we tell. We liberated Europe. Well, we liberated those parts of Europe that the Soviets didn't take. Those parts of Europe we were not liberating. It took a little while longer for them to be liberated, but we did liberate the parts of Europe that we did liberate, which is pretty good. So those concepts, we don't unweave those as historical concepts. We hear them and imbibe them as narratives to give us a sense of who we are as individuals and where we fit in the world. And it's incredibly confusing the moment you stop and start thinking about this, which is why we tend not to want to do that. Just to give you an example, and back to the difference between a nation and a state. So when European colonists show up in Americas, there are of course many large groups of people here. You have all kinds of Indian nations and other groups. They did call them that equivalent of the word nation, and it is applicable to the Indian tribal groupings, but they were not states. This is the key distinction. They did not have anything really, you could argue maybe as you get down to the Southwest, maybe. So you can maybe make that argument down there. But in much of the eastern seaboard and Central America, they did not have this notion of a state. They had a notion of a shared area, like the Iroquois, we all live around here-ish. Shared identity, we speak one of the languages of this grouping. And by the way, I always like to say this, the number of linguistic groups in the Americas pre-colonization is unbelievable. The cultural and linguistic diversity was off the map. There were not Native Americans. This is like the stupidest idea of all time. There was this unbelievably rich and diverse spread of hundreds of different cultural and linguistic groupings that covered the continent and lived in every possible way under different, they were just amazingly diverse. There was no uniformity at all, which was sort of the magic of it and kind of the tragedy of it. But the linguistic richness was huge. The national richness was huge. They did identify themselves as conceptually clear groupings, but they weren't states because generally speaking, although again, as you get close to the Southwest, you might get some of this, they didn't have an organized central leadership that said only we get to determine who gets to commit violence. They generally did this through lots and lots of negotiation. Should we fight this? Maybe, maybe not. So it was not what we would consider a state. And so as the colonists come across, there was this complete disjuncture about how they were thinking about things. This one where the natives often just couldn't quite figure out what we were up to until it was often too late. And so that disjuncture in history, right, we need to write those people out because they do not fit in our narrative. It's not an accident we tend not to talk about Native Americans. By the way, this notion that we stole the Native American lands, people talk about this. It's sort of a notion, but the Native Americans were stealing the lands from each other perfectly fine for thousands of years before that. So it's really not a new thing to them, people stealing land. They just didn't understand quite how we were doing it and why we were so successful. This was a real question. And one of the reasons we allied with them is because they thought, oh great, this is our chance to ally with these strong people and steal land from those natives tribes over there that we've hated forever. We don't know these people, so let's kill those people. They didn't realize, of course, this was going to be a bad deal in the long run. But so they understood stealing land. This was totally clear to them. They didn't understand like state. They didn't understand this sort of control system. Basically, they didn't understand what we're up to at all. It took them a very long time to conceptualize this because it was so different. Because the concept of a nation state was so new. And so again, when we think of our narratives, it's very challenging for us to write those sorts of stories in because it confuses our ideas. That confuses our sense of, oh, well, how are we supposed to relate to that? Is that part of our history? And I've used this before as an example, but it's so good I'll use it again, is maybe 20 years ago, Kennewick Man was undug somewhere in Kennewick, I believe, and it was a skeleton of unknown ancientness, I guess. That's a terrible word. Of how they didn't know how old it was, but they knew it was quite ancient, several thousand to many thousands of years old. And so then a debate began whether the scientists should be able to study this or whether the natives in the area should claim it as one of their own. What was curious about this, as far as I could tell, no one thought this person was an American. This person was not an American. The natives did not identify Americans. Americans did not think, oh, we found one of our lost relatives. Roughly around the same time in Ireland, they dug up the Bog Man, who was this perfectly preserved, I think it was 10,000-year-old body. And I mean like fresh cadaver, perfectly preserved for 10,000 years. So it was this huge archaeological find because they're going to get so much information out of a body that's well preserved for that long time. But everybody in Ireland thought, well, this is an Irish person, right? This person is Irish. They just happen to be a 10,000-year-old Irish person. Neither of these are coherent, by the way. I'm not saying one is more right than the other, but it tells you the distinction of the kinds of narratives people tell themselves. In Ireland, they say, we've been here forever. In America, we say our history starts on July 4th, 1776. Everything that happened before then is sort of, no one cares about that. Right? And this is the magic narrative that nation states tell themselves. One of the problems with this, of course, is narratives really, really matter. and shaping how we understand and respond to the world. And one of the functions of the nation state, particularly around the turn of the century, 1900, 19-teens, 1920s, is nation states in some places began to fill the role of religion. Because notice that historically, the story you used to believe that told you how the world worked, where you fit into it, and how you were supposed to live was primarily a religious story. This is why kings and emperors, popes, were very important. Most ancient kings were often the leaders of the native local religion, right? Because their association with the gods was association with the narrative that explained why they were in power and you should do what they say. Part of the narrative. So when the state and religion, well, when religion, particularly in Europe, starts falling on a hard time and people start being less religiously interested, the nation state becomes increasingly functionally, like you can't tell the difference between a religion and the nation state. It takes on many of the roles, takes on the guises, takes on often the fervor that was once given to centralized religious organizations. Oh, we don't believe in that anymore. Well, let's believe in the state. Let's believe in the destiny. We have this like manifest destiny in the United States. It is our destiny given by whom? Well, apparently God, right? To bless our state, which now has a religious avocation to go out and conquer. This is a change of tone. Like the early European, like French and Dutch and British traders who went to, say, India or the Moluccas or the Spice Islands, they didn't have like a religious mission. They thought, man, if we trade over there, we can make a lot of money. That was their mission. Because they didn't come from what were clearly identifiable nation states, so they didn't have that sense. They're like, oh, we have this legal structure, we live in a place, it's important, we have a religion, but we're businessmen, we're going to try to make money. That's our story. It's only later that you started to get this very, very strong principle of, oh, let's go out and bring our national story, our national power, our nationalism to different places. Which is weird, but it's weird at first, but it's also very clear if you think of it as a religious movement rather than a political or sociological movement. I guess religious, sociological, closely allied, but it was more of a religious fervor, and they kind of melded, and political power and religion joined, and all of a sudden you got these very aggressive, very sort of, again, totalitarian nation states that model quite perfectly what old religious nation states or religious institutions used to do. And so they said, why was certain aspects of the Soviet Union and of fascist Germany so horrible is because they were precisely running like medieval religious wars, which were in just a much smaller scale. They weren't industrialized, but they were just equally horrible. And so there's many historians, Burley and others, have remarked on this, and I think it's a pretty accurate way of thinking about how wrong the narrative can go. It doesn't mean it has to go wrong, it can go right in other ways as well. So we live in these stories that we're told, that we're raised in, that in some ways we functionally need. And I think one of the confusions that we face in the world today is the narrative of the nation state itself is failing. Not the narrative of any particular state, just the whole narrative of a nation state itself. A couple of things are happening. So, for instance, in the United States, we're not coherent geographically. Alaska and Hawaii are not attached. So, okay, that's a little bit of a challenge, but the rest of it is sort of more organized-ish. Unless you don't talk about Puerto Rico, always good not to talk about that because that makes no sense at all. But so slightly geographically coordinated, but huge. And what does the East Coast have to do with the South, have to do with the central of the country, have to do with the West Coast? And increasingly, these sorts of geographical divides are showing up as like pretty serious cultural divides. Were we ever that culturally homogenous? Historically, no. There's zero evidence of this. We've always been very culturally diverse because we're massive. We're a massive country. And then the other ones that people look at with nationalism in particular is, what about language? Right? Have we been linguistically coherent? No. Millions and millions of immigrants from all over the world Plus, when you add states like Arizona and New Mexico in 1912 with very large Spanish-speaking populations, what you get is a linguistically diverse nation. We like to pretend like we only speak English. It's one of our founding myths, because we need that. If you're going to be coherent as a nation, one of the things you claim is to be culturally coherent. The big mark of cultural coherence is a shared language. So we like to pretend that we have a shared language. We sort of do. Lots of Americans sort of speak English. But we also have, I think we're the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. I think we passed Spain a while ago. So anyway, we're a huge Spanish-speaking population. We have people who speak every language from all over the world. And we sort of all get along in English. We pretend like we only speak English, but that doesn't mean we're that coherent in English. Particularly where you are in the country. If you're in Arizona, Texas, southern Florida, you'll notice that a lot of people speak a lot of different languages. But again, it varies by country, where the area of the country. But this is not just an American phenomenon. It seems to be going on all over the world. Part of this seems to be global media. How do you conceptualize your world? Well, you'll need it in some sort of box. And for a long time, the box was my region. I live in Washington. I'll get news about Washington. Oh, now we get national news. I'll get news about the United States. Oh, now we get international news. I get news from everywhere in the world if I want to. And so how do I conceptualize my narrative when it's now being influenced by stories, ideas, concepts, images, events from the globe? Right? It becomes this real challenge to having a narrow, nationalistic, culturally rigid focus in a single area. Also, history gets really messy when you start having other people talk about history. Right? This is one of the curious aspects, right? It's if you tell the history of the United States from the perspective of the founding fathers, you get a different one than if you tell the history of the United States from French political history, right? Like there's a different, it's not the facts aren't different, what the story is and what it means. For instance, the French were pretty pissed off that after they had helped fund our war against England and had helped use their navy to pretty much secure victory, that the first thing we did when the war was over was sign a bunch of trade treaties with England. They're like, no, sign treaties with us. We're like, yeah, no, hey, that was great, but we're going to go back to trading with England because that's where the cash is. Right? And France was like, hey, damn, that's no good at all. Right? But that's what we did. So the French view on this, very different from what you would get from it. And the more views of the world you get, the more confusing any narrow sort of nationalistic identity kind of narrative becomes to maintain. Also, how you identify and see the world. It's very difficult for us to grasp, but for most of human history, most people would never go farther than maybe 5 or 10 miles from where they were born. If you went 100 miles and came back, you would be a celebrity. People would be like, tell us what it's like out. I'm not making this up. This is very true. Tell us what it's like out there. These travelers who went in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century places and then came back were toured through European capitals. Why? Because they had seen things that nobody else had seen, nobody had written about, nobody had experienced, and everybody wanted to know that. But how many people here have been to outside the United States, been to a country outside the United States? This is preposterous. This is wrong, right? You know the best place in the world is here. There's absolutely no reason ever to leave. Why go someplace else and just ruin your lives? No. This is the best place that ever was or ever could be. This is part of the narrative of nationalism, particularly United States flavor of nationalism. But that's breaking down as people become more mobile. We can go and see different places. We can see different news, different information, different music, different cultures inundate us. Also, different global organizations, right? People always talk, transnational capitalism, these big companies that span the world. That itself changes your entire perspective. No one is confused. People say, oh, Apple is an American company. Well, sort of. I mean, it's kind of based here. They might eventually pay taxes here, but probably not. But there's Apple phones in more places than the United States of America, shockingly enough. There's mobile phones made from, just all over. And lots of things are like that. You go to the store, occasionally you'll see something made in China, right? Just imagine that, right? You might find one or two things made in China. How is that possible? Again, we're so used to that we forget that even 50 years ago, that was extraordinarily unusual. If you had something from China, that probably meant you had a relative who maybe fought in the war, or who traveled over there. Maybe they were a missionary. For some weird reason, they went to China and brought you back something, oh my God, from China. Can you believe that? We're not that shocked anymore. We're not like, wow, you should do this in a store. Hey, look, that came from China. Can you believe that? People would be like, this person is an idiot, right? Like, because we know everything comes from China now. And it seems simple and obvious and natural, but it's also very sort of undermining of our sense of geographic coherence, our sense of historical narrative, our sense of where we are in the world, where we belong, what we're supposed to be doing, because we get all of these inputs, both physical and intellectual, from all parts of the world, which we ourselves can now travel to and experience, and pretty much people do. And so, hey presto, these narratives start to fall apart. But again, what else is a nation state if not a story? And theoretically, it's supposed to be a common story. Functionally, this is definitely falling apart. But again, not just here. China is going through one of its incredibly repressive stages in history. Xi has decided that the North Korean model is the way to go, right? For some reason, he thinks this. But what's pretty clear is he's trying to fight against precisely the same things that's bedeviling other countries in the world, which is this fracturing sense of China as a single nation. Why do you have to crack down on the Uyghurs? Why do you have to try and enforce Chinese language so powerfully? Well, because you're terrified of diversity, because diversity and exposure to the outside world and outside ideas starts to suggest that, this narrative about China that we've been telling ourselves for either 50 or 3,000 years, depending on how you score, is not necessarily complete. Doesn't have to even be wrong. There might be other narratives we could tell about ourselves. So one of the things is China likes to say that it's a coherent country. It's an empire. It's just been an empire for so long that everyone's forgetting that it's an empire. But look at Chinese history. They've successively conquered outlying areas and done massive amounts of work to try to incorporate them. My favorite detail is there's only one time zone in China because they want there to be one time. They do Beijing time. They do not want people to have a notion that you're on even a different time zone. This seems both bizarre and telling, right? We're all together. We're all the same. We're all in the same history. We all share. This is our narrative. It's sort of one of the most extreme versions of the nationalist state's dream. So that's sort of the background on this, sort of fast zoom. Sorry about that, but a lot to cover. What are the ethics of this? And I'd like to go back to what I said before, is this child marriage notion, right? One thing that's important to remember is it really has nothing to do with you. It does have a lot to do with you, but you didn't select it. Right? That's the curious idea here, is that they did not select for where you live. You were born where you live. You were born in your nation state. It was basically forced upon you, or just inevitable. I mean, I do imagine what it would be like to live in a world where when you were 19 or 20, you got to pick which country you were going to live in. And so notice any country that wanted population and wanted people in it would have to do stuff to attract people, right? Like Disneyland would be the biggest country in the world, I think. But right, you would have to have some system of going, hey, we're pretty good. You'd be competing, Because if everybody thought your country sucked, nobody would join it. They're like, I don't want to join that. I want to join someplace else. That place looks better than this place. Oh, they've got pretty good weather, they got nice beaches, and there are no wars. That looks like a good place to go. Think how different people would feel about the world is if you knew this. Like, you are not a citizen of a country until you turn a certain age and you join voluntarily. It would change a lot, I think. I think it would be. But don't hold your breath, by the way, on this notion. But if you ponder that and start thinking, it's like, so it's the same thing with World War II. Like, we won World War II. I'm like, yeah, I did nothing. I really did nothing. My parents didn't do anything. My grandfather, he might have done something, but probably just because he got drafted. He probably drank most of the war. So what does it have to do with me? I mean, it's influenced my life, but I didn't participate. It's not my choice. Why I identify with it is sort of strange. And then what we do, of course, we identify with the parts we like, and then we tend to downplay the parts we don't like. Both, by the way, are equally weird. To take credit for conquering the Germans, it's weird. To feel guilty about slavery, weird, right? To feel guilty about, not even guilty anyway, to feel that something should be done about contemporary racism, that makes sense, because it's contemporary. It's hard to do things about racism in the past because of the whole historical problem, right? I wasn't there. I wasn't born. My relatives weren't born. My relatives weren't even here, right? So they came much later. So see how strange it is? But these are the narratives that we tell ourselves, that we involve ourselves in. And then we go, I should feel this way, I should feel that way. So one of the first ethical principles, I would say, which again, ethics is the notion of how you incorporate it into your own life, your own thinking, your own outlook, is to ask yourself, what part of this has anything to do with me? And this is going to be a hugely variable answer. I'm not saying there is a correct answer by any stretch of the imagination. But what part of this has anything to do with me in the sense of these are things I would choose, these are things I believe in, these are things I value? Shaped you? Yes. By the way, like I mentioned before, I was just in Europe, and it turns out Americans are indeed noisy. I like to think I'm not that noisy. It turns out I am exactly as noisy as all the other noisy-ass Americans, right? We're just noisy. Oh my God, we're so noisy, right? So that's sort of a trivial but hilarious, slightly embarrassing trait that we've acquired. That's fine. But, what part of this do I want to actively say, yeah, this is mine. This I agree with, this seems important, this seems influential to me. And which part do we go, yeah, I just happen to be born someplace, right? Why would I be hugely invested in this? And what's weird is we fought a war to overthrow the aristocracy. Why should you be somebody important just because you were born? You were born the Duke of something, the Duke of the Nether Regions, and so therefore you're important? No, that's absurd. Exactly right. Just because you were born someplace doesn't mean you should take that as being some sort of personal value, some personal validation. Just like being a duke. I'm not a duke, we don't believe in that. I'm an American. It's like, okay, that's different, but not that different. It's a change, but not much of a change. And so if you can start thinking about it this way, because we just automatically go, oh yeah, we don't believe in the aristocracy. Why should somebody think they're important just because they were born into some particular family? That's silly. Yes. But with nation states, we're like, no. It's not silly with nation state because it's totally different for some reason that no one ever articulates because it's not different at all. And that's that trick. And then it goes back, if you even go further, like I said, I love the 23andMe, where are my roots from? Oh, I'm Italian, or I'm a German, or I'm French, or I'm from Scandinavia, or I'm from Africa, or whatnot. It's like, yeah, so I love this, by the way, because they are broken down that way. Italy, by the way, political institution and polity that's existed for maybe 100 years, maybe, on a good day. Africa, a continent, right? Scandinavia, a region, right? Like, oh, this is your genetic heritage. It's either from a nation state that's only existed for 100 years, from a region in Northern Europe, or from a continent. Wow, science. This is not science, ladies and gentlemen. This is nonsense. Of course it's nonsense. But we love this nonsense because we think knowing the nations the cultures associated with nations, which is nationalism, will tell us something about ourselves. What it tells us is that we really love the idea of nationalism and cultural identity. But it really doesn't tell us much about who we are as individuals, of course. But these are the narratives. So one big experiment you can run is to really ask yourself, what part of this polity that I've inherited, that's influenced me, that I live in, not by choice, do I really, really sort of go with? Like, yes, I think these are incredible values. These are really good. These are the ones I buy. And which parts do you go, yeah, no, not so much. Not so much what I'm about. I think I'm about other ideas. And if you can start making that list for yourself and clarify that, what you'll see is like, oh, this is just a big confusing morass. Like a lot of these values are mutually exclusive, right? Like just they don't work together. For instance, America, we say, God, country, and money, right? These are the three American values. It turns out those things are not always totally coherent, right? And what we really know is that it's money at the end of the day. You can't worship mammon and God, and America has chosen mostly mammon. That's what we do. And again, if you go to someplace like rural Mexico or rural Spain, or people I've been to Africa, people I've talked to from Africa, it's just, you have no idea how much we care about money till you be with people who don't. And you're like, wow, I'm loud, and it's just inculcated in me. Like, it's a thing. And other people, they're just like, like, why do you guys care so much? Like what? Like in a lot of cultures, not in Europe, but all over the world, it's actually rude to ever talk about money. Like it's so you can't say, oh, I just got this new car and I got a great deal on it and I saved $1,500. Oh God, that is like, I'll just walk in your house, take my pants off and sit on your couch. How's that, right? Because no, you don't do that. Like, but it is really, really aggressively rude to talk about this. In American culture, because we're so inculcated to say, oh yeah, money is what is important, what you talk about, what people want to know about, what people are interested in, give or take on average. Now, if you start thinking that may not be the case, you've probably already felt the friction between your narratives and your personal choices. By the way, what's weird is almost no one ever makes decisions to maximize money. It's one of these weird things. We talk about money, everybody thinks they're after money, they say that they're interested in it, but if you look at their activities, they just don't. They're not. They don't care. They kind of sort of pretend to care. So the great example I've used with my students for years is, I say, what's your purpose of education? Get a good job, make money. I'm like, great. The number one paying job is petroleum engineer. Everyone go and enroll. A bachelor's degree of petroleum engineering starts at about $110,000 a year average. The starting salary, 4-year degree. Almost no one goes into it. High demand. Right? If people were actually going to school to make money, it would be a mile-long line to get into petroleum engineering. But there's not, quite the contrary. More people are trying to get degrees in French literature than in petroleum engineering, which is weird if you're motivated by money. Not weird if you're motivated by other things. So these are the sorts of notions that even though we personally may not agree with, or we may behave differently, functionally, when you watch people, they'll still imbibe and talk as if they do care about that narrative. But if you watch the way they behave, they don't care. Or they sometimes they even feel bad about not caring. Right? You have to sort of justify why you're acting slightly differently. So step one in the ethics department is to ask yourself, which part of this do I actually care about and matters to me and I would like to imbibe? Step two, I would say, is to reflect on this and to say, what part of this might be harmful to me? Right? What part of this might actively be detrimental to my personal well-being? Because again, national narratives are not personal. They have nothing to do with you. You're born into them with like a fish in water. But imagine you're a hydrophobic fish. Wow, this would suck. Right? This would be really, really bad for you. It's a fish. You didn't do it. You're just born a fish that has like an allergy to water. Like, damn. right? Like this is the way this nation-state narratives work, right? They're not personal to you. And so what happens is often nation-states produce not one but several. And you get sort of the Chinese menu approach. You can take one from here and one from there and one from there and sort of construct your own sub-narrative. But this is why I think often, again, I've mentioned this before, is they keep saying that the history is the only necessary subject for the humanities. And it's because you start seeing and experiencing and understanding, oh, there's all these other ways to think about it. There's all these other approaches. The great Persian idea of what are the Persian ideals for if you're going to be a good Persian person? Tell the truth, ride well, shoot an arrow, right? Be a good archer. That was their goals. By the way, if you look at the Greek, Roman, and Persian world, the Persian world put a very high value on truth. I mean, really high value on speaking the truth to people who matter. Peasants don't matter, but to people who matter. The Roman and Greek world, no value on truth. They could care less about speaking the truth. It wasn't a value to them. They didn't believe in it. Lie all you want. Be a trickster. Odysseus, one of the Greek heroes, lies the entire time. He's just lying all the time to everybody. Penelope, his wife, is back home lying. Penelope lying, Odysseus lying. They're going to lie their way until they can reunite and slaughter everybody who's been giving them a hard time. That's a spoiler alert on the Odyssey. There's your narrative. Right? And people go, oh, so there's a culture that just like truth. Meh. They had other values, other things that are important, other narratives that they wanted to embrace. And so one is to ask which works for you, which do you embrace, which do you think of. But one, at least I would say equally important, is to ask yourself, which of these don't work for me? Which of these are like, I don't know. I see it everywhere, I hear it all the time. It's inculcated in me, but is it really helping me? Does it help me grow? And again, the problem is it's very hard to reflect on our own stories because they're how we build identity, and they're just written into us so consistently. But one of the advantages of a time like our own, when we feel tension and confusion, is it does give you a little more grip. It gives you a little more opportunity to go, hey, wait a second. Maybe that is not such a great idea. Maybe this isn't such a functionally awesome narrative. Maybe there's parts of this that don't work for me, and I should start rethinking those and reflecting on them. And finally, again, which is just historical work, I don't know how else one does this, is to ponder like what you like from other cultures that we don't have. I mean, this is the Renaissance to such a shocking degree, it's hard to imagine. They acquired access to ancient literary texts, primarily Greek and Roman, often through the Arab world, often through new translations of Roman classics. And they were like, wait a second. This is a totally and completely different way of looking at the world. Now, it's not all good, obviously. Like I said, read Plato's Republic. It's just, oh my God. Like, it's such a Stalinist, oppressive idea, but it's different. It's mind-bogglingly different. Aristotle, or the plays of Aeschylus, or Euripides, or all these classics that came to them like, oh, this is just a new way of looking at the world. And once you start opening that up, then you go, oh, well, maybe, anytime I talk to anybody who travels, I always ask them the same question, amongst others, is, what one thing, if you could bring back from that country to our country, would you want to have here? Like that, what do you think that they're just doing better, or is more interesting, or is more fun, or whatnot? And it's like, and why? And it's just amazing that almost everywhere people go in the world, they always have at least one, often more, but at least one thing where they go, oh, one of my friends went to Germany, and when he came back, he said, walking paths everywhere. It was so great to just walk on walking paths everywhere. I thought, wow, that'd be great. And that's doable. It's not like some huge overthrow of the system. But some people go to Spain and say, siesta, good. Taking that break in the afternoon, super good. Right? Totally in favor of this. But different countries, different cultures, different ways of approaching life. It gives you, again, this is why traveling messes people up, why you should not travel. Because it exposes you to different ways of looking at the world. And so if you can back your way out of this a little bit, I mean, it's easy to go in and criticize the history of nationalist policies and expansion and wars and all this, but in a way we need narratives to give us a sense of coherence in the world. And how else are you supposed to build polities? And like I said, nations go way back, not nation states, but nations go way back. Shared people, shared stories, shared languages. That's an old thing. The state, pretty much a new thing. The nation state, definitely a new thing. But at some point, it's very important, I would say, to start going, hey, now wait a second. I got an arranged marriage before I was born to this society, these ideas, this nationalist tendency. That doesn't seem like a good deal. Right? It's necessary, but I mean, how good is that? So maybe I should ponder it a little bit. Maybe I should start, getting a little distance, a little reflection, a little insight, so I can go, oh, this works for me. Again, it's not overthrow the government or whatever. It's like, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. I would really prefer if we had that. That's not even in the system at all. And the more you do that, I think the more you'll be able to feel the tides of nationalism and the tides of these national stories that we tell that feel so natural that it often is hard to identify them. But again, if you go to another country for a long time, or you have the big historical experience, or cultural involvement with people from a different culture, all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow. Yeah, that's just different. I'll leave with one last story. I was talking to Mariana. She's from Croatia, and she said, I said, well, I'd heard that Croatian is a fairly patriarchal society. And she just started laughing at me. She's like, no, you don't get it. Women run everything in Croatia. She says, we have a word or a phrase, which she said, and I cannot repeat because I don't know the language, which means man in front, women in charge. They said, so if you do anything, you'll see a man around someplace, and we go, oh, that guy must be running things. And she's like, never. Like, this is never happening, right? The power is there, but the power is really in the women. I thought that's very interesting because it's a different way of conceptualizing the whole notion of the relevance of men and women. I haven't been, so I can't verify it, but she seemed very adamant on this point. She just laughed at me like I was an idiot, which I probably was. And she's like, no, anybody who says that just has no experience or understanding of the society. So I can't wait to go one of these days and experience this and see for myself. But I thought, oh, there it is again. My notion of what not being a patriarchal society or being a patriarchal society must be is written from my own cultural experience. And here's a society that's doing it differently, but not differently in the sense that I would ever articulate or understand. And that's, you go, oh, that's right, there's just another one of those blockages, another one of those blindnesses that we have. So today, on our celebration of something, 1776, when we defeated the British and won our independence and started, that was the 13 colonies. They weren't here, by the way. Washington State is 100 and some years away. But nonetheless, apparently we share in this great tradition of something. So ponder that, where these stories come from. Notice a national holiday in a state that is 120 years from being. We're celebrating something that was 13 colonies over a couple of thousand miles to the left here. Very odd, but that's how the narratives work. So nationalism, thank you very much.